Okay, we have a keynote guest speaker today. Her name is Heather Barrett. Heather was born and raised in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, where she still lives with her family. She holds a Bachelor of Music from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Masters of Arts in Journalism from the Western University in London, Ontario. Heather is a journalist, storyteller, and international award-winning and radio documentary producer. She's also a longtime producer and a host of with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Board of St. John's. When she's not telling a story, Heather is an avid knitter and runner, but not at the same time, of course. Please welcome Heather Barrett to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. It looks like you're having a really great day. It looks like really delicious food. And I'm here to tell you about a book that I co-authored with my friend Xavier Michael Campbell called Black Harbour. And it's the story of Black people, enslaved and otherwise, in Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, when I was your age going up through school, that's our book. Xavier was supposed to be with me today, but he couldn't, so he says hello to everybody and wishes that he could be here with you too. All right, so that's my friend Xavier. Xavier is from Jamaica, and he came here to study at Memorial University, and he loves living in Newfoundland and Labrador. He's a Newfoundlander by choice and really feels at home here. He grew up on an island surrounded by water. We have a lot more things in common, which I will get into. I can tell you that Xavier grew up watching NTV, so he knows all about Captain Newfoundland and Captain Canada and Tony Marie Wiseman. And Xavier writes fiction, so he writes novels and short stories and plays. Now, me, I work at CBC Radio. I'm a radio host and producer, so that's me at work early on Saturday and Sunday mornings. So I've been a journalist in this province for many, many decades, from just before the internet. So I've been around for a really long time. And I was working on a story one day at my office about the new holiday for Canada about Emancipation Day, which is on August the 1st. And that marks the day that the British Empire around the world abolished the enslavement of Black people as workers. And when I was interviewing my guest about it, she said, wherever there was colonization, there was slavery. And growing up here in Newfoundland and Labrador, you hear about Newfoundland was a British colony for many, many centuries. So I thought, wait a minute, does that mean that there was slavery here too? And she goes, oh yeah. So I started asking some questions, and I realized that that was the case. So actually, where our quest first started, Xavier and my's quest, was in 1987. And it was in a little town called Lansalou on the southern tip of Labrador, where that little dot is on the map. So 1987, Madonna and Michael Jackson are top of the pop music charts. The haircut known as the Mount Pearl curl is very popular. Shout out to the Mount Pearl curl. Everyone had really big hair, lots of hairspray. But in June of 1987, a very unusual thing happened in Lansalou, Labrador. There was heavy rain. A coffin in their cemetery got uncovered by the rain, and some remains, human remains, which means bones, were sticking out. And once someone in Lansalou discovered that, they told the town office called Memorial University, an archaeological team who went up to see what this was all about, and they discovered that the bones were of a Black sailor. And everyone's going, what was a Black man doing on the south coast of Labrador? And they figure about 1810, 1812, so that was a very long time ago. And these were the clothes that Black sailor was wearing. This is what was discovered in that coffin on the south coast of Labrador. And this is now preserved at the rooms. It's wool pants and a woolen jacket, and there was a shoe, and there was a knife blade and a few coins and things like that. And The suit is really small because people were smaller at the time, but it's still, you could almost climb into it if you were the right size. And the only thing we know about this black man was that his initials were WH. And the reason we know that is because the initials WH were carved into that knife handle that you see there. So, who was, oh, sorry, I need to go back. Who was WH? We don't know. At this point, his remains, like his bones, are still stored very carefully at the rooms, in a room downstairs that's especially designed for these sorts of things. So that set everyone on a quest. Who's WH? Black man, south coast of Labrador. What we discovered is that many, many, many people from all over the world came to Newfoundland over the centuries. When I was your age, going to school, most everyone I went to school with looked like me. I had dark brown hair before it's the color it is now, blue eyes and pale skin. My ancestors were all originally from England hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Most of my friends had English and Irish ancestry, so it was not at all a very multicultural place. So this was very just surprising to us. Anyway, people from all over the world for centuries came to Newfoundland and Labrador to fish cod, because codfish, before the time of refrigeration, was an excellent protein. You could dry it, you could salt it, it would be preserved for months and months and months. So anywhere around the Atlantic Ocean where they could take a boat and they could sail to places where they could fish cod, that's what they came back with. It was very, very commonly eaten. And here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we like to think that we are the biggest consumers of cod and salt cod. But the truth is, if you go to any country that borders the Atlantic Ocean, from Newfoundland down through Nova Scotia, down through the southern United States, Brazil, South America, the west coast of Africa, up to Europe, you will find traditional salt cod dishes. And that's why the codfish brought everyone here. So that's what I told you about, the universal protein. People in rural communities still salt and dry cod like that. It's been preserved that way for hundreds and hundreds of centuries, and it's fed many, many, many people around the world. So this is what I'm telling you about, the triangular trade. We were taught when I was going through school in our history books that it was mostly people from England and people from Ireland, maybe a few people from France, maybe a few Portuguese and Spanish that came to Newfoundland and Labrador. But the truth is, people and goods and ideas circulated all around the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic Ocean was like a super highway because, of course, there were no cars or trains or roads invented at that time. So anywhere that bordered along the Atlantic Ocean, you could take goods from one place, send them to the other. You could take people from one place, send them to the other. You could trade things back and forth. And so, for example, rum was traded, sugar, spices, manufactured goods, raw goods, and another commodity was enslaved black people. And that's where we come into the connection between Newfoundland and Labrador and the transatlantic slave trade. So European ships were what we were taught in my history books when I was growing up here in St. John's about who came to Newfoundland for fish. And we were told, again, mostly British, the English, and the Irish, maybe a few French, but that were like most of the people that came here. But the truth is, European ships had a wide variety of people working on them. 1 in 5 people above a ship that was from a European country in the 15 and 16 and 1700s was a person of color. So this is a shot from a movie from the 1950s called Moby Dick, and it's the film adaptation of the book about the whale. So you can see that the range of people that were in this film about an old-timey ship, and you can tell that they're very diverse, and that is actually more of an accurate look about who may have been on a British ship that came to Newfoundland, or who might have been on a French ship that came to Newfoundland over the years. So, people of my age thought that Newfoundland wasn't a very multicultural place. But the truth is, it was, and it always has been. Now, Xavier and I wanted to know more about this and the idea that, oh my gosh, there were enslaved Black people in Newfoundland, which we were taught that, slavery was obviously a very terrible thing, but everything we learned about it, it happened in the United States, maybe in South America, but it certainly didn't happen in Canada, and definitely not in Newfoundland. But Xavier and I went to the colony of Avalon in the town of Ferryland, south of here on the Avalon Peninsula, to find out more. Have any of you ever been to the colony of Avalon on a school trip? Okay, a few people have. Now, the colony of Avalon was a British colony, like a town, set up in the early 1600s in Ferryland, which is about an hour and a half, an hour or so drive from here in Mount Pearl. And in the early 1600s, this was a very modern place, even though it was in Newfoundland, which was far across the Atlantic Ocean from Britain, in a place where the weather was really, really harsh. It had all the modern conveniences of early 1600s life. It even had flush toilets. You could actually go down on the wharf in the harbor, sit on the toilet, and let the tide in the harbor wash everything out to sea. So it had everything. The only thing it didn't have was Wi-Fi. So it was a thing. So with that came everyone that would be living in a British colony at that time. And here's Xavier talking to Barry Galton, who is the head archaeologist there. So in the colony of Avalon, there were people of very high status, people with names like Lord Baltimore and Lady Baltimore. There would have been sort of people in the middle, people who would have been fishermen and fishermen's families, people who would have fished and maybe kept little kitchen gardens or, like did things in the community to run the community. And then there would have been servants, which would have been, very poor people of low status. Most of them were Irish, but other servants were enslaved Black people, which means if you're enslaved, you have no choice. You are not getting paid for your work. You are not there because you made a decision to go there. You were made to go there by somebody else. And this is how we know that there were enslaved Black people in Ferryland. This is the last will and testament of a man named John Benger, who was a fish merchant in Ferryland. And in that last will and testament, he is willing his servants who were slaves to other people when he died. So here is what his will said in 1791. I also make free my Negroes Sancho and Sarah and all of Sarah's children, who I desire may be sent to Mr. Robert Carter of Ferryland. The boy Jack, the girl Nancy, and the boy Stephen are all free and to be maintained in a manner as poor children are meant to be as trades or servants. So we know that Sancho and Sarah were enslaved Black people in Ferryland. They had children who were known as Jack, Nancy, and Stephen. So we have names. The reason why we don't know much about enslaved Black people in Newfoundland and Labrador was that no one really counted them as people. So they were often, you had to look different places for them. You had to look in records of, say, materials or equipment, like 4 cows and 7 slaves. So that was very difficult. So anyone who wants to know more about enslaved Black people living in Newfoundland, you've got to do a lot of detective work and find mentions of them in other places. You also find them sometimes in legal records as well. So there's that. And the other part, how Newfoundland was connected to the transatlantic slave trade, Black people from Africa, was that ships were built in Newfoundland that were used to transport enslaved Black people around the world. So large ships were built everywhere around the Atlantic coast, in Newfoundland, in Canada, the United States, South America, Africa, Europe, and they were built to transport all sorts of goods and services around. So a ship could be built to transport salt cod. It could be built to transport rum. It could be built to transport Black people. And that's called the Middle Passage for people who study Black history. That trip across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to North or South America was extremely dangerous. There was a good chance that people would not survive it. They were put in very, very cramped, dirty quarters in the bottoms of ships, so there was a lot of disease and a lot of sickness. Going across the Atlantic Ocean was very dangerous. Many ships sank. So we know that probably millions of Black Africans died in what's called the Middle Passage. They met their fate on the Atlantic Ocean. So that's more ships that were built in Newfoundland that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And again, there's a place, you can look this up online, called the Slave Voyages Database. You can actually do some detective work and find out more. So again, that's more about the Newfoundland-built ships that moved Black bodies around the world. So we have those connections. Now, let's go back to the salt cod, because if Xavier was here, he would be telling all of you about how he grew up eating salt cod. And I grew up eating salt cod, but the salt cod that we both grew up eating was very, very different. The way that I grew up eating it in my house was pretty plain. You know, my grandmother would boil it in a pot with potatoes and brews and just the fish. There were no seasonings or spices. I mean, the salt cod was salty, but we might have scrunchions with it. So, you know, traditional British, English, Newfoundlanders do not eat a whole lot of spicy food. I mean, it was very filling and very tasty, but not very exciting. Now, Xavier eats very exciting salt cod. Okay, that's my salt cod right there. So potatoes, a few scrunchions, which are tasty, but not very exciting. And there's Xavier's salt cod. Ackee and saltfish is the national dish of Jamaica, and that's very thinly sliced salt cod with a plant called ackee and all kinds of spices, and it's really delicious and has lots and lots of flavor. So when Xavier and I met, we started talking about food that we liked, and we're like, you eat a lot of salt cod? I ate a lot of salt cod. But anyway, I'll tell you, I need to go backwards. We're going to get into more food in a minute. I'm going to tell you about the different types of salt cod, because not all salt cod was created alike. Some was of extra special grades. It was like really plump and juicy and tasty, and it could be, you know, reconstituted to something that was really like, you know, fresh fish. And others wasn't so good. And then there was a very low grade stuff. Now this is a note that came from the year 1980 from a man named Kevin Toop, who was one of my teachers in high school, but who also fished with his father in the summers in Trinity. And there were different grades. So choice salt cod would go to Europe, and that was the best kind of cod. Standard cod, you know, not so great, but it could pretty much go anywhere. And College was the lowest grade of salt cod, and that was the cod that would go to Jamaica and the West Indies and the Caribbean. Why did it go there? Hundreds of years ago, the cheapest, the poorest grade salt cod was sent to the Caribbean to feed enslaved Black people who lived there and worked against their will in sugar fields and doing mining and doing all sorts of very, very difficult labor. So anyway, there's my salt cod, fish and brews. There's Xavier's salt cod, ackee, and salt fish. Now, both Xavier and I love to bake. And Xavier grew up baking with his grandmother in Jamaica. I grew up baking with my grandmother in St. John's, and we would like talk about our recipes and things that we really loved. And Xavier started making Newfoundland snowballs when he came here. He said, hey, these are really good. But he's like, flaked dried coconut. What is that? And I said, oh, that's coconut. And he said, no, coconut is this delicious fruit with a hard shell, and then you got the flesh, and then you got the water and the milk, and it's like, I don't think I've ever had that. So he was very amused to see what we called coconut on the snowball here, and also a little bit confused. It's like, why would there be coconut in Newfoundland, in a traditional Newfoundland food? And the same way with rum. Rum is everywhere in Newfoundland. If someone in your life drinks rum, you can go into a Newfoundland and Labrador liquor store. There's a wall of different types of rum to try. Same way in Jamaica, a wall of different types of rum to try. And of course, Newfoundland Screech is a rum that came from Jamaica. And that's something that's been part of, our heritage and our folklore that we tell tourists every year. And we say, oh, it's because of the salt cod trade with Jamaica. Well, there's a little bit more to that salt cod trade because, as we know, that originated by having to give enslaved people fuel to do enslaved people's work. They worked in sugarcane fields. Sugarcane is made into things like rum and molasses. They made the rum and molasses. That came back in barrels to Newfoundland, product of the transatlantic slave trade. So again, molasses. How many people have molasses in their kitchens at home? Okay, lots of hands. I have molasses too. Now, I just thought everybody loves molasses. Wouldn't every single kitchen have molasses in it? Not so much. But when Xavier came here again, he grew up eating molasses, and he was amazed at how much people love molasses here. Being able to go to Costco and get like big bulk containers of molasses. He's like, who eats this stuff? Well, it turns out everybody from Newfoundland, because molasses was brought up from the Caribbean to Newfoundland in exchange for the salt cod, which were sent down to feed the enslaved people who did the work that created molasses back in the day. So that made us conclude that Newfoundland is a way more multicultural place than we ever thought it was. It certainly is now. I can just look in this room and see so many people with so many different diverse heritages and backgrounds and cultures that you all bring every day to your school and to your friends. But it certainly wasn't when I was growing up, and when I studied history, I certainly wasn't told anything about that. And when we, tell people from around the world, come be a tourist in Newfoundland, come visit, they look at tourism ads like this with little pale redhead girls running slowly along the cliff and their grandmothers, and that is Newfoundland, or so we thought. But we now know that Newfoundland doesn't look like that at all. If we look in this room, it looks much more colorful and interesting. And we also know that in centuries past, Newfoundland was much more colorful and interesting, and maybe not for always good reasons at the time. So when we think of Newfoundland, we think of it in a more wide way. And I would encourage you, there are lots of historians and researchers and history detectives now trying to find out more about all the different kinds of people that were in Newfoundland and Labrador at the time. Bushra Junaid is based in Toronto now. She grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador. Her brother Richard was in my class in high school, and I think he was the only black person I'd ever seen in person at that time. But Bushra has done some amazing work exploring black culture in Newfoundland and Labrador, and she wrote a book called The Possible Lives of W.H. Saylor. So it's more a book for younger kids. It's more of a little kid's book, but it's really interesting to read, and she imagines what W.H.'s life could have been like and what he was doing in Lansalou on the coast of Labrador. So her work is really cool. And there are other books you can read to find out more. There's a historian in Halifax named Afua Cooper, who's written a very important book called The Hanging of Angelique, about a young black woman who was hanged in Montreal. But Afua Cooper has done lots and lots of research on the history of enslaved black people in Atlantic Canada. There's all kinds of things you can read about sugar and the important part that it created in the world from the West Indies and how all that moved around the triangular trade and around the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a little bit about enslaved black people in Canada, and we're starting to learn a little bit more about it. There is an amazing artist named Camille Turner, who has done some work in Newfoundland and Labrador, and she explores what life may have been like for enslaved black people here back in the day. And there's also the Slave Voyages database, which I told you about, where you can do some investigation. There's a website called Slavery North. Xavier and I collaborated on some audio documentaries about WH and about all the people that came here in ships from around the world, and about our favorite foods that explores all these connections. So that's about everything I've got to tell you about. Our book is called Black Harbour. It's a really, really quick read. And Xavier and I both told chapters, one from my point of view, one from his point of view. So we explored both my Newfoundland heritage, Xavier's Jamaican heritage. We bonded over the foods that we both share and looked into the historical roots of that. And we came to the conclusion that everybody has long historical roots in Newfoundland and Labrador. You may think that maybe your families are new to Newfoundland and Labrador, new to Canada, but we do know that people from all over the world played an important part in building this province into what it is. Oh, well, for me, it was that time I did the radio interview with the expert who said, wherever there were colonies, there was slavery. And that started me digging into it. And that I first started digging into it with my job at CBC. And then I met Xavier, who was digging into the same thing because he was writing a historical fiction book about Newfoundland and Jamaica in the 1700s. And then when we did our radio project, Gavin Will, the publisher of Boulder Books, asked us if we'd like to turn it into a book. So that's what we did.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing this story with you. And honestly, I have learned something as well, that we do have some similarity culture with Newfoundland and Jamaica. Who knew? Did anyone knew that Jamaican culture was somehow similar to Newfoundland? Saltfish ackee, and you guys call it even ackee. That's very, very interesting to me. Molasses. That's very cool. So thank you very much. We really, really appreciate it, and we are happy to have you here today. So before we move on, I would like you guys to ask yourself a question. I would like you, as you go along and see what we have after, think of what you have learned here today. Think of what you can take away from here and impose it into your own community, in your schools, or your friends at home.